Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It is the 2nd of October, and as always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information, which you can find anytime at weather.gov/Alaska. Once you click that page, you'll be able to jump to the Alaska Pacific River Forecast Center with information about your rivers and streams or the lack of precipitation in your area in parts of Southeast. You can jump to aviation weather forecasts. You can check out the terminal aerodrome forecast for your airport in question, as well as checking the latest satellite and radar pictures or just general weather forecast for any part of Alaska. If you can't find what you want, please do email me anytime at david.snider@noaa.gov, and feel free to use the Alaska Weather Information Line 1-800-472-0391 for your forecast anytime, no matter what phone you're on. Let's take a look at the drought monitor. This isn't something we normally talk about because we usually don't have significant areas of widespread dry weather across a large part of Alaska, but in this case it's happening in a place that is not used to significant dry weather, and one of those spots would be Ketchikan in this case. The drought monitor tries to group areas of dryness that has been pervasive across a geographic area and then talk about what those conditions mean as far as soil moisture and lack of precipitation, the impacts that it has on your community. In this case, many parts of central and southern Southeast have really seen an exceptionally dry year, notably July and into September, very dry periods for you. Ketchikan Airport, from the water year now, if you measure the water from October 1st all the way to September 30th, it's what we call the water year, so not the January 1st to December 31st period. If you measure it that way, the precipitation we've seen this year has been about 100.78 inches. Now, for really just about any part of the country, that is an exceptional amount of water, unless you're Ketchikan, because we know that Ketchikan normally gets a tremendous amount more water, and in many locations this would be record-setting. In Ketchikan, the average amount, the kind of run-of-the-mill over 30 years, comes out to be 141.25 inches. Well, this is well below that. And when you start losing about 40 inches or so of rainfall for any location, that starts to have some significant impacts. This is 72% of normal, the third driest water year on record for Ketchikan. This is having impacts for power production and water supply. And many locations in southern Southeast are right along there with you, from Heidelberg up toward Petersburg, all in severe drought, which is just mind-blowing if you think about the general weather trends that usually are found in southern parts of Southeast. When you move up a little bit further, we're in moderate drought. That does include Juneau, all the way out toward Gustavus and Haines, and then down toward just about Sitka there for lesser amounts of dryness, but certainly still some very dry weather. If you want to check this out and read more about what the drought monitor does and find out more information about how it's used, this is usually something that really impacts agrarian societies, communities like in the Midwest or the plains that are really dealing with rain or not enough of it when they're trying to grow their crops. But this is the place where you can learn more about it, droughtmonitor.unl, University of Nebraska-Lincoln.edu. And they're a partner with NOAA and, again, monitoring Southeast right now. And, again, the Ketchikan Airport and lack of rainfall we've seen so far this year. Let's see if there's any in your forecast future, and right now it doesn't look like there is. As we move on to the satellite picture, a very strong wave of low pressure is working its way into the central and western Bering. A precursor to that has been trying to work into southwest and across the Gulf. You can see that frontal boundary kicking up clouds all the way across the Gulf and nudging its way into southeast, but not with any rainfall. It looks like all that's going to stay well offshore, and there's a wealth of dry air that's undercutting these clouds and keeping conditions just very dry right now across southeast and really most of the mainland as well. As we get into Tuesday night and Wednesday, it looks like this area of low pressure here will continue to expand and probably deepen a little bit more as we get into the overnight hours. We're dealing with mainly marine areas that are looking at storm force winds across most of the Aleutians and just north. But the good news is, while there is considerable amounts of wind flowing around this weather system, it doesn't look like there's going to be any widespread wind moving over land areas. So no hurricane force wind warnings for any land areas at this point, only for marine warnings. And we're talking about storm force winds at this point, mainly for the southern Bering Sea coast and areas just north of that up toward the low pressure center. The good news is, as this moves east and north, it will bring some rainfall to parts of west and southwestern Alaska. The strongest winds, though, should stay off of the mainland. We did see some lightning out around the Shemya region today. Low pressure there down to 955 millibars this afternoon. As this occluded front is working its way across the eastern chain, the strong southwesterly winds will give way to a even stronger westerly flow. I do expect some strong gusts to continue through tonight, tomorrow, and the next several days. The precursor, this early wave working through southwestern Alaska, was bringing rain to the Kenai coastline out around Seward and into western sections of Prince William Sound. You can see a trailing cold front also trying to move off the mainland. This is pretty dry. Drier air moving off the southeastern mountains, keeping another fairly nice day over southeast, but not when you're looking for rainfall. A trough of low pressure sits across the Alaska Range. This is generally moving north, but won't move very quickly over the next several days. That'll pretty much stay in place. As we get into tonight, low pressure is hovering around 960 millibars, a very strong north and westerly flow coming into the central and western chain. Widespread area of rainfall from St. Paul to St. George down through the central and eastern Aleutians. A triple point part of this low pressure system forming around Sand Point and just east, traveling toward Kodiak Island. If we're going to see some heavier amounts of precipitation, it will be in this general vicinity as that spreads up through southwestern Alaska. Also looking at some areas of snow across the western Alaska Range, so that should be generally limited as the air is pretty warm. Looks like the freezing levels in most locations running around 9 to about 10,000 feet, so we're not expecting to see any significant snowfall across most areas right now. Low pressure sitting across the northern Gulf. This is much weaker there at 1,007 millibars. A trough of low pressure lingering across the eastern Gulf, separating the advance of the warmer and wetter air from what we see across southeast is just significantly dry all the way across the middle and upper Yukon to the north slope, and then high pressure takes the reins up there around the Arctic coast. As we get into your Wednesday, the low pressure level really doesn't change too much, still hovering around 960 millibars. The occluded front wrapping in on itself all the way across southwestern Alaska. Eventually, this part of the boundary will gradually fall apart. The low pressure system at the triple point where the warm, the cold, and the occluded front meet up. And this is where the warm and the cold air is wrapping over itself. And this is more of a classic low pressure system here. This is all wrapping up around Kodiak Island, and this is going to be one of the stronger parts of the storm moving northward into the Gulf, bringing better chance for rainfall there in the next several days to places like Prince William Sound, Seward, around Homer, and southward toward the Kenai Peninsula. Lake Iliamna dealing with some wind, probably some choppy weather tomorrow and turbulence as well. And then as you see the pressure lines coming together across the central and western chain, certainly some opportunities for severe turbulence, but that should be generally limited. A widespread area of moderate turbulence is certainly expected there and up and down the west coast through the Norton Sound and southwestern Capes region. As we look at southeast, still high and dry. It looks like a generally clear day for many locations there, and pleasant weather across the central and northern interior. If you get into a valley where there's not a whole lot of wind, do expect to see some frost. The temperatures are dropping fairly quickly as we're losing that sun angle just as quickly. To the west on Thursday, low pressure is hovering between 968 millibars around that original core, and then another piece of that's developing on the south and western flank at 978 millibars. That will keep a general state of unrest going through the Bering Sea, and looks like a south and westerly flow will be the rule for most of the central and eastern chain. For the northern Gulf, 1,002 millibars there. That's the leftover piece of that puzzle. We'll keep some unsettled weather across south central, but not so much southeast. Things stay fairly dry there. A quick check of temperatures for tomorrow morning, mid to upper 30s, maybe 40 degrees around the capital city. In the morning, south central, you're looking at low to mid 40s. Kodiak City looking at 46 degrees. Southwest, mid to upper 40s for Bristol Bay out toward Nunivak Island. 48 in Nome, 30 for Utqiagvik, 18 for Arctic Village, 21 around Fort Yukon. In the middle Tanana Valley and Fairbanks region, you're looking at lows in the upper 20s, so sub-freezing for you. Northway about 18 in the morning, and the central and western chain holding in the mid to upper 40s, 43 in St. Paul, up to nearly 50 in St. Lawrence Island tomorrow. The north slope back in the mid 30s, the middle Tanana Valley low 50s, south central also staying fairly mild.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
On to aviation weather now. We'll see kind of a smattering of MVFR conditions across the Bering Sea and the southwest coast. You'll notice a lot of IFR developing on the windward sides of some of the Aleutian chain and the Alaska Range here and into the Kenai Mountains as that strong southerly flow pushes moisture right into the southwest coast and into the Bering Strait. Now, there will be some patches of drier weather here. You can see those forming up across the central chain around St. Paul and St. George, almost up to St. Matthew as we start out your Wednesday morning. As we get into Wednesday afternoon, notice VFR conditions all the way from southeast up to just about the eastern end of Prince William Sound, all the way across the interior of the North Slope, a large part of the western interior in the middle Yukon Valley, and then hit and miss MVFR and IFR, again on those windward sides as that very large low pressure system across the central and western Bering continues to sit and spin and remain fairly strong as we get through the end of the week. As we get into your Thursday, MVFR spreads eastward just a little bit. We'll start to see some changes across northern sections of southeastern Alaska. MVFR and IFR conditions should be expected around Chilkoot and White Pass and perhaps into the Lynn Canal in some cases. Again, remembering that strong southerly flow working its way in through the inner channels and then eventually hitting that higher terrain across northern parts of the Panhandle. Conditions should remain the same around the Kenai Mountains and parts of the northern sections of Prince William Sound at Portage Pass, the Alaska Range down around the Killbuck Mountains, and then patchy MVFR across a large part of the Bering and most of the west, central, and eastern chain, as well as the Alaska Peninsula. Some hit and miss IFR conditions across the north. That should improve as we get into Thursday afternoon. Not a big change across southwest or the chain. South Central still looking at IFR conditions Thursday afternoon around the Alaska Range and your western passes. MVFR conditions into Tanita Pass and IFR across the Chugach Range around Prince William Sound, and IFR still spreading eastward slowly toward parts of southeast. Let's take a look at your pass conditions for your Wednesday now. Anaktuvik and Adigan Pass, we expect to see VFR conditions in both cases there. That should remain the case for Thursday as well. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass looking for IFR conditions for your Wednesday, and into Rainy Pass also expecting to see IFR throughout your day. But from that point eastward, conditions should be generally clear. Windy Pass looking for VFR. Isabel Pass also expected to see VFR. Mentasta Pass looking pretty good for Wednesday. Tanita Pass also expected to see generally good conditions. IFR, though, especially on the eastern end of Portage Pass and creeping through a little bit for your Wednesday, just about all day long. Chilkoot and White Pass at this point expected to be VFR, but remember, changes coming on Thursday. Freezing levels indicate pretty warm air from the Alcan border westward. You can see levels climb to as high as 8,000 feet across the Arctic. As you move south and west, they begin to lower as that colder air is being dragged in behind the Bering Sea low pressure system there, but also warming up across the Alaska Peninsula and moving eastward into the Gulf. Icing potential is there, but most of that right now is pretty high up there, above about 9,000 to 10,000 feet. A lot of that running into drier air across the mainland and parts of southeast. But from the Kenai Peninsula and Prince William Sound westward toward a large part of southwest, levels there will gradually start to fall off. Expect them to hover around 10,000 feet for most of the mainland, but don't be surprised if you start to see some icing potential showing up around 8,000 to 9,000 feet in the coming days. The jet stream right now has a potent area of low pressure sitting across the Bering, with wind speeds wrapping in almost at 100 knots. The main corridor of fast-moving air is running around 130 to 150 knots across the Northern Pacific, and it will continue to grab onto Western Pacific typhoons and cyclones, sending them slowly our way. At 9,000 feet, you can see that broad southerly flow across the mainland coming in around 10 to 30 knots, but as you move quickly westward towards southwestern Alaska, 30 to 50 knots should be expected. Stronger winds coming in from the west for the chain, 30 to 50 knots there, and those winds are fairly broad in scope. Look for a generally easterly flow north of the Brooks Range, 15 to 20 knots, and light and somewhat variable winds across southeast, 10 to 15 knots in most cases. Similar conditions at 3,000 feet, generally a southerly flow as high pressures losing ground across southeast. Southerlies for most of the mainland, anywhere from 15 to 25, and then much stronger winds around the Aleutians and especially just north of the Aleutians to St. Paul, anywhere from 55 to 65 knots. Turbulence then could reach severe limits, isolated in its case around most of the Aleutian chain below 5,000 feet. But more broadly, considerable moderate should be expected for all of the Aleutians into parts of the Alaska Peninsula, Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, all the way up the southwestern coast, into Norton Sound and into Kotzebue Sound. Up north, we expect to see isolated moderate across the North Slope below 4,000 feet, and probably looking at developing areas of turbulence around the Kenai Peninsula as we go through your Wednesday. That's a look at your aviation forecast. I'll be back in just a few minutes with the rest of your marine weather. Stay tuned. Welcome to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service, and joining us today, two more people to talk about the augmented reality sandbox. It's Alana Valaji. She's a University of Alaska Fairbanks mechanical engineering student, helped design and work on the details to make this new type of sandbox there. Thanks for joining us, Alana. Thanks. And Courtney Breest, she's the outreach coordinator for AKwx, which is the experimental program to stimulate competitive research. It's a program funded nationally by the National Science Foundation, right?
Yes.
Okay. Alana, tell us about how you changed and adapted this version of the augmented reality sandbox. It's a really cool tool.
So Gina approached us with 3 goals for this new version of the sandbox. They wanted it to be compact in a light system that could travel around the state. They wanted it to be child-oriented, so we designed the sandbox to have 3 different levels.
Okay.
It's pretty cool. You can have younger children, you can have high school kids. I guess I should say high school teenagers.
Sure.
And then we also designed it to be more marketable, user-friendly, so that this could be seen eventually in classrooms all over the place, all over the state.
Okay. And you had a big hand in this, but this was a team approach, right?
Definitely. It was a really good experience for myself, for George Stevens, who we'll see later.
One of our hand models today. Yeah.
For 2 other members who aren't here today, Cody Klingman and Austin Hunt. And it was just a really good learning experience all around.
Very good. And this is something that is part of your learning experience as well, so you get to check a box in your education.
Yeah,
right?
it's a requirement for seniors of mechanical engineering at University of Alaska Fairbanks.
Very good. Very good. Well, it is a wonderfully inquisitive tool, fun to play with, and I hope to get my hands in the sand here in just a little bit. But it's also part of a bigger program, something that we were talking about a moment ago, AKwx, and that's what Courtney is here to tell us more about. What is AKwx and why do you need a sandbox?
Well, AKwx, as you mentioned, is a national program. We're funded nationally, but we're actually located statewide. We're at UAF, we're at UAA, we're in Southeast at UAS. And she mentioned, you know, taking the sandbox as an educational tool, and that's where I'm an outreach coordinator for the South Central test case.
Okay.
Our focus is on the Kenai watershed, and we are really interested in using these tools like the sandbox to interact with the students down there and get them interested in STEM and also communicate the research findings that we've been having throughout the state.
Okay. And one of those, as George and Eric are kind of changing the contours for us there from UAF to maybe something that resembles a little bit of something more of the Kenai watershed, which is one of your focuses for the study, right? And specifically looking at some of the changes there and how that impacts people and also the salmon.
Yes, it is all of our research is social and environmental.
Okay.
So we have social scientists working hand in hand with our environmental scientists. One of the things we're studying is Upper Russian Lake, and we have a researcher taking sediment cores from that lake. So one of the things we're going to use the sandbox to communicate is how the landscape changed over a long period of time, thousands of years, going from glacier, covered by glacier ice, to being filled with water. And
that's what they're doing right now.
Exactly. So
live.
So they're moving the water around. And then I think they've got some props over there, because we're also going to go a little bit more in depth and explain how the salmon got there.
Okay.
So using
there's
these.
the salmon.
Exactly. Oh, I think there's a few more.
Yeah, we like more salmon in Alaska. More salmon.
Yeah, exactly. So it's really taking the findings from our research grant and just trying to connect with the community and translate it in a really hands-on and exciting way so people can, you know, interact with us as much as possible.
Well, sure. That makes the learning and the science real and quite literally in your face rather than just some boring black and white paper that you have to read about. This is something that people can understand better because it's visual and they're touching and feeling and seeing these changes, right?
Yeah, and get them engaged. And then outreach is a huge component, and working with the younger students, and actually even, I mean, working with the UAF graduate and engineering students it's a huge part of our grant, and we really enjoy it.
Oh, it is wonderfully exciting. And so, Alana, you were telling us that this is built to travel.
Right.
And this is built to do more things than version 1. Where can this type of project go in Alaska? And what can it demonstrate?
I mean, we were hoping to eventually get to villages that were harder to reach, that you couldn't necessarily move a whole fixed instrument to, right? You need something that can pack up, fit in your truck bed. I mean, one of the most attractive parts of this project is that this was going to be something that was used past our graduation point. You know, this is going to be something that lives in the state for years.
Right, right. Well, it looks like you're well on your way with that. So what are, give me another example. What else can this show us? We've talked about the Kenai River watershed. What's the coolest thing that you've played in the sand with? What's your idea?
Well, I definitely enjoy the props, but we also like kind of building up a giant mound, and if you put some water behind it, you can make a little runway, I guess, and you know, demonstrate the effects of the hydrology by just putting up a dam and letting it all pour right down. And so that could, I think you mentioned it earlier, you could even demonstrate the effects of a tsunami.
Right.
Or something along those lines.
So it's not just topography, but it's also hydrology and coastal surge mapping and some of the coastal changes that we're seeing here in Alaska, and seeing what the smaller changes in the sandbox might do to kind of a real effect of a slosh or a push of water up on the coast. Tsunami inundation mapping, or even glacial dam release, as some has been demonstrated before. So wow, that's just an impressive thing. That it seems like the possibilities are nearly endless with this, and probably even more ideas that are popping up in your head too.
Yeah, as we speak.
Very cool. All right. Well, if folks want to get more information about AKwx, you guys are online. You're on Facebook, Twitter, and on YouTube. AKwx, right? AKwx, Alaska AKwx, that is. And again, you guys are funded by the National Science Foundation, so more to come from that, and a longer-term study there. Thank you, ladies, for joining us today. Congratulations on your hard work there. This is really fun. And for now, I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with this edition of Alaska Weather Facts, and I'm going to go play in the sandbox there. We'll see you next time.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
On to your marine weather now. As we are still sitting very close to the sea ice minimum for the year, we're still noticing at least a little bit of 80% or less concentration or marginal ice generally north of Utqiagvik and Barrow, and around Dead Horse to Prudhoe Bay and northward. But there is still generally a pretty expansive area of somewhat open waters, not sea ice free, but generally less than 20% concentration from areas from Dead Horse to Prudhoe Bay and north and east of Utqiagvik. This trend will continue until we get some much colder air in the region. Right now, that doesn't look like that's the case, with high pressure sitting to the north and a general easterly flow. Some of this could certainly be on the move as well. For the very latest sea ice information, anytime head to weather.gov/Anchorage/ice. For a look at southeast now, we turn to our marine weather with a general south flow moving through the inside passages. Southerly winds up the outer coast as well, 10 to 20 knots, with seas holding around 8 feet on the outside and about 2 to 4 feet on the inside. As we get into your Thursday, look for winds to come in a little bit more from the south and east, 10 to 15 knots there, 2 to 3 foot seas on the inside, still running around 8 feet on the outside, but winds up to 25 knots outside of Cross Sound and a little bit stronger across the northern Gulf up toward Yakutat and Prince William Sound, 25 to 30 knots with 9 to 11 foot seas there on Thursday. In South Central, and especially in Prince William Sound, look for winds out of the east around 20 knots and 4 foot seas there. 7 to 8 foot seas across the northern Gulf. Seas or winds around 20 to 25. Around the Barrens, 25 to 30 knots, 7 to 8 foot seas expected there. A northeasterly flow coming down from northern Cook Inlet, 20 knots with about 5 foot seas on Wednesday. Those will pick up to 6 foot seas as we get into your Thursday, with that northeast wind strengthening up to 25 knots south of Kenai and north of Homer. Look for a south and southwesterly wind outside of Hitchinbrook Entrance. Southeasterlies as you move into the northern Gulf, 30 knots there with 10 to 11 foot seas. Easterlies continue inside of Prince William Sound, 30 knots, expecting 6 foot seas on Thursday. As we look out west, you'll start to see some of these hotter colors out across the southern Bering Sea. More on that in just a minute. But first, Bristol Bay southeasterlies, 35 knots with an 8 foot sea, 11 to 14 foot seas across the North Pacific, 25 to 30 knots blowing in, a southeasterly wind over Shelikof Strait. As we get into Thursday, the remnants of the Bering Sea storm still pushing high winds and seas eastward toward Bristol Bay. But right now it looks like southerlies, 30 knots, 19 foot seas there north of Cold Bay should be expected. Southeasterlies at 25 inside of Bristol Bay, and 20 to 30 knots across most of the northern Pacific with 10 to 16 foot seas in coastal waters. Now here's a look at the Bering Sea storm itself, with storm force winds expected across the central, western, and parts of the eastern chain as we get into your Wednesday. Sustained winds 45 to 55 knots with storm force wind warnings across the marine areas, but not looking at high wind warnings for any of our land areas, including AKwx or ATKA at this point. Seas will be up there, 35 to probably higher seas expected across Wednesday. Across the North Pacific, 45 to 50 knot winds expected, 27 to 30 foot seas expected on the Pacific side. A look for westerly winds to remain strong from Kiska to Attu, 31 to 34 foot seas expected with 50 to 55 knots over the coastal areas. As we get into Thursday, considerable improvement with a northwest flow at 25 knots, 11 foot seas in the west. Southwesterlies moving through the central and eastern chain, 30 to 35. Seas still up there, 23 to 24 foot seas expected across the Bering with 18 to 21 foot seas there across the northern Pacific coast on Thursday. For the western Bering, look for a south and southeasterly, or I guess I should say the west coast, south and southeasterly flow across the YK Delta. Easterlies over Norton Sound at 35 knots. St. Paul and St. George are looking at 35 knots with an 18-foot sea on Wednesday. By Thursday, stronger winds, southwesterlies blowing with a 23-foot sea expected, 40 knots there. A south and southeasterly flow off the rest of the west coast, anywhere from 25 to 40 knots with 15-foot seas north of Nunivak Island towards St. Lawrence Island as you go through the remainder of your day. From the north slope, steady easterlies, 20 to 35 knots sustained, 8 to 9 foot seas across most of the north slope. As we get into your Thursday, winds remain strong out of the east, 30 to 35 with 11 foot seas there across the north coast, and 25 knots off the Chukchi coast with 9 to 6 foot seas as you move southward. Let's take a look at your weather one more time as we go through tonight. A strong area of low pressure in the Bering at 960 millibars pushing a front into the west coast as we saw storm force winds across the coastal waters of the central and eastern Aleutians. Rainfall limited to southwest and the northern Gulf Coast, not so much for southeast. Looks like dry weather continues for you. Most of the wind issues will be out across the Aleutian waters, but not over the land areas themselves, so no major warnings out for any one spot. Severe drought continues in southern parts of the southeast. Head online for more. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.